single mother Sarah Whitfield thought the collapsing barn floor she was desperately trying to repair with her last $89 and a crowbar borrowed from her elderly neighbor was just another costly disaster threatening to complete her family farm's financial collapse after 3 years of failed harvests had destroyed her wheat crops and left her 45 days from foreclosure proceedings that would eliminate 4 generations of family agricultural heritage. But when her 13-year-old daughter Lily's insistence on helping led her to pry up the wrong floorboard in the northeast corner of their 1920s dairy barn, Sarah discovered a hidden tunnel system that connected to the legendary outlaw Blackjack Sullivan's treasure cave containing $3 million in stolen bank gold, along with documents proving that Sullivan's 1889 execution had been staged by a secret alliance between railroad moguls and territorial judges who had been systematically embezzling federal land grants while using Sullivan as a convenient scapegoat, a conspiracy that modern descendants of those same railroad dynasties has spent 134 years ensuring remained buried beneath Montana farmland, where missing persons cases involving persistent treasure hunters rarely receive sufficient investigation to threaten family fortunes built on institutionalized government fraud. This is the story of how a desperate barn renovation and one stubborn 13-year-old's refusal to follow adult safety warnings transformed a broke single mother into the guardian of evidence that could expose the true origins of America's Western railroad empires and destroy political legacies worth billions of dollars. If this moves you, hit subscribe, give it a like, and share where you're watching from. The October wind swept across Whitfield Ranch like a funeral dirge, carrying with it the bitter scent of dying wheat and the promise of another brutal Montana winter that would test the structural integrity of buildings, equipment, and human resolve that had been systematically weakened by 3 consecutive years of agricultural failure, resulting from climate conditions that exceeded anything documented in regional farming records spanning back to territorial settlement periods in the 1880s. At 42 years old and 14 months removed from her husband Marcus's death in a grain elevator accident that had eliminated not only her emotional foundation but also the mechanical expertise and physical labor capacity essential for maintaining large-scale agricultural operations, Sarah Whitfield faced the mathematical certainty that her family's 1,847-acre ranch would be liquidated through foreclosure proceedings that Glacier Valley Agricultural Bank had initiated after reviewing her 4th consecutive quarterly report showing operating losses that exceeded revenue by margins that made continued financing impossible according to federal agricultural lending regulations. The ranch had been homesteaded in 1887 by her great-great-grandfather Jeremiah Whitfield, a Civil War veteran who had used his military land grant and savings accumulated during 10 years of railroad construction work to acquire what was then considered marginal grazing territory that previous claimants had abandoned after discovering that surface water sources were insufficient to support cattle operations using conventional ranching methods available during the late 19th century territorial expansion period. Jeremiah had transformed the property through innovative water management techniques, including construction of underground cistern systems and seasonal irrigation channels that captured snowmelt and distributed moisture throughout growing seasons in ways that made wheat cultivation possible on terrain that neighboring homesteaders had declared unsuitable for agricultural development. 4 generations of Whitfield men and women had expanded the property's productivity through careful resource management and adaptation to changing agricultural markets, maintaining family ownership during the Dust Bowl years when corporate agricultural interests had purchased distressed farms throughout the Northern Plains region for fractions of their productive value, consolidating small family operations into industrial farming enterprises that prioritized efficiency and profit maximization over soil conservation and community sustainability that had characterized traditional farming methods developed through generations of practical experience and environmental observation. The Whitfield Ranch had survived economic pressures that had eliminated over 70% of family farms in Glacier County during the past century, including the agricultural depression of the 1920s, the Dust Bowl ecological disaster of the 1930s, the agricultural mechanization transition of the 1950s, the agricultural credit crisis of the 1980s, and the corporate consolidation period of the 1990s and 2000s that had transformed American agriculture from family-based operations into industrial food production systems controlled by multinational corporations whose financial resources and technological capabilities exceeded anything available to independent farming families.
But climate change had introduced environmental variables that traditional farming wisdom couldn't address effectively when unprecedented drought conditions had made conventional wheat production impossible, despite Sarah's implementation of water conservation techniques, drought-resistant crop varieties, and soil management practices that had proven successful during previous dry periods documented in family records and regional agricultural extension service reports spanning over a century of farming experience in Montana's challenging climate conditions. The drought had been extraordinary in its severity and geographical scope, creating conditions that exceeded the adaptive capacity of sustainable farming methods while simultaneously making the expensive irrigation infrastructure required for continued production financially impossible for family operations whose profit margins had been eliminated by 3 consecutive years of total crop failure. Sarah's transition from military logistics coordinator to ranch operator had occurred under circumstances that provided insufficient time for developing the comprehensive agricultural knowledge and mechanical expertise that successful farming required, particularly during climate crisis conditions that challenged even experienced operators with decades of practical training and family mentorship in traditional farming methods. Her 8 years of military service in supply chain management had provided organizational skills and crisis response capabilities that proved valuable for ranch administration and financial planning, but had not included the seasonal agricultural knowledge, equipment maintenance expertise, and soil management understanding that determined success or failure in Montana wheat production under normal conditions, much less during unprecedented drought emergencies. Her 13-year-old daughter Lily had adapted to their increasingly desperate circumstances with the analytical intelligence and practical problem-solving capabilities that she had inherited from both parents, making her an essential partner in ranch operations despite her age and physical limitations compared to adult agricultural workers. Since her father's death, Lily had assumed significant responsibilities for livestock care, equipment maintenance assistance, and financial record-keeping while maintaining academic excellence at Jefferson County Middle School despite the emotional trauma and economic stress that had transformed their family life from rural middle-class stability into daily survival management requiring constant vigilance about expenses, resource allocation, and crisis prevention strategies. Lily's personality combined her mother's military discipline and organizational approach with her father's mechanical intuition and agricultural understanding, making her particularly effective at identifying problems and developing solutions that adults might overlook due to their assumptions about conventional farming methods and standard operating procedures. Her understanding of their financial situation was comprehensive and realistic. She monitored their declining bank balance through online banking access, tracked weather patterns using agricultural forecasting websites, and maintained detailed spreadsheets documenting ranch expenses and potential income sources with accounting precision that impressed the agricultural extension agents and bank loan officers who visited periodically to assess their operational liability and financial stability. The barn that served as the operational center of Whitfield Ranch had been constructed in 1923 using regional building techniques with locally sourced timber from the Blackfoot National Forest and limestone foundation materials quarried from deposits on the property's eastern boundary, creating a structure that had proven remarkably durable throughout nearly a century of Montana weather extremes and agricultural use patterns that had evolved from dairy operations to grain storage and modern equipment housing. The building represented the accumulated capital investment and practical wisdom of 4 generations, housing essential ranch equipment including tractors, combines, cultivation implements, and harvesting machinery that represented over $200,000 in current replacement value despite their age and technological limitations compared to contemporary agricultural equipment. The barn's interior layout reflected the evolution of American agriculture from labor-intensive family operations to mechanized production systems, with modifications and additions that documented changing technology and operational requirements throughout the 20th century. Original construction had emphasized dairy cattle housing and hay storage, with stall arrangements and ventilation systems designed for livestock management, while subsequent renovations created equipment storage areas and workshop spaces that accommodated increasingly sophisticated machinery and maintenance requirements that modern farming demanded for competitive efficiency and productivity levels. But the barn's floor had been deteriorating progressively for several years due to moisture infiltration and structural settling that had created dangerous weak spots and potential collapse areas that threatened both equipment storage security and personal safety during routine maintenance activities. The flooring consisted of thick wooden planks installed over limestone foundations using traditional spacing and support techniques that hadn't anticipated the weight and vibration patterns created by modern agricultural machinery significantly heavier than the horse-drawn equipment and dairy cattle the barn had been originally designed to accommodate safely.
Sarah's engineering analysis of the floor deterioration, based on structural assessment techniques learned during military facility management training, had revealed that comprehensive repairs would require extensive reconstruction involving foundation reinforcement, support beam replacement, and complete floor plank installation that would cost approximately $18,000 if performed by professional contractors with appropriate equipment and materials. But her available resources consisted of $89 in her checking account, basic hand tools inherited from her husband and father-in-law, borrowed equipment from neighboring ranchers who understood family farming solidarity during crisis periods, and the determination to attempt repairs herself using salvaged materials and volunteer labor that might restore minimal functionality without eliminating their family's remaining financial resources. The renovation project had become Lily's primary after-school and weekend activity when homework responsibilities were completed and ranch chores had been finished according to schedules that balanced her educational requirements with practical contributions to family survival efforts that required every available hour and resource to maintain basic operational capability. Her involvement wasn't motivated by simple curiosity or desire to help, but by mature understanding that successful barn repairs could preserve equipment that represented their only remaining assets with potential resale value if agricultural operations became completely impossible and liquidation became their only option for debt reduction and financial survival. Lily's approach to the renovation project reflected her methodical personality and analytical capabilities that had been developed through academic achievement in advanced mathematics and science courses, combined with practical problem-solving experience that exceeded typical 13-year-old responsibilities due to their family circumstances requiring adult-level participation in complex decision-making and crisis management activities. She had researched traditional barn construction techniques through internet resources, agricultural extension service publications, and historical building preservation materials available through the Montana State University Agricultural Library System, identifying structural engineering principles that governed priorities and effectiveness. Her investigation had revealed anomalies in the barn's construction that didn't align with documented building techniques from the 1920s or conventional agricultural architecture that characterized similar structures throughout Glacier County during the same construction period. Specific areas of the floor displayed construction characteristics that suggested modifications or additions had been made after initial construction, with materials and techniques that indicated work performed during different time periods, using methods that weren't consistent with normal maintenance activities or repair procedures that would be expected during the building's documented operational history. The most puzzling anomaly was the northeast corner of the barn, where floor construction showed evidence of deliberate design features rather than structural modifications made for practical agricultural purposes. The planks in this area were secured using different fastening methods with materials that appeared older than the surrounding flooring, despite logical construction sequences that should have resulted in uniform installation techniques and material characteristics throughout the floor system. Additionally, the spacing between support beams in this area didn't match the regular intervals used throughout the rest of the barn, suggesting that this section had been designed to accommodate specific requirements that differed from normal agricultural storage and operational needs. Lily had documented these construction anomalies through detailed measurements and photographs that she organized in research folders that demonstrated investigation skills and attention to detail that impressed Sarah, despite her concerns about Lily's increasing obsession with what appeared to be minor historical curiosities during a time when their family's immediate survival required focus on practical repair work and financial crisis management. But Lily's systematic approach had identified construction inconsistencies that raised questions about the barn's history and the purposes it had served during different ownership periods and operational phases that weren't documented in family records or county historical archives. The morning of October 22nd had begun with their typical crisis management routine, reviewing bank statements that confirmed their account balance had dropped below $100, monitoring agricultural commodity markets that showed wheat prices remaining below profitability thresholds for small-scale operations, and planning barn repair activities that could be accomplished using borrowed tools and salvaged materials that wouldn't require additional financial investment. Sarah had been calculating whether they could afford heating oil for the upcoming winter when Lily had requested permission to assist with floor assessment activities in the northeast corner where her measurements had identified the most significant construction anomalies.
Sarah's military training in facility maintenance and structural assessment had developed her ability to identify potential safety hazards in damaged buildings, making her confident that Lily's participation could be managed safely if appropriate precautions were maintained and dangerous areas were clearly identified and avoided during exploration activities. Lily's assistance would also provide additional analytical perspective on construction details and repair priorities that could improve project efficiency while strengthening their mother-daughter collaboration during circumstances that required family unity and mutual support for effective crisis management and survival planning. Using a crowbar borrowed from their elderly neighbor Eleanor Hartman, who operated a small organic vegetable farm adjacent to Whitfield Ranch and had been providing both emotional support and practical assistance since Marcus's death, Sarah had begun systematic removal of deteriorated floor planks to assess foundation conditions and identify support structures that would require reinforcement or replacement before new flooring could be installed safely and effectively. The crowbar was a professional-grade tool that Eleanor had purchased during her own barn renovation project several years earlier, representing equipment quality that Sarah couldn't afford, but that was essential for efficient plank removal without damaging potentially reusable materials that could be incorporated into their repair efforts. Eleanor Hartman had become an essential source of practical support and agricultural wisdom during their family's transition from prosperity to survival mode. Sharing equipment, providing childcare assistance when Sarah needed to travel for employment interviews or bank meetings, and offering the kind of neighborly cooperation that characterized rural community relationships during crisis periods. At 73 years old and 47 years of independent farming experience, Eleanor possessed comprehensive knowledge of traditional agricultural methods, seasonal planning strategies, and resource conservation techniques that had enabled her to maintain financial stability during market fluctuations and climate challenges that had eliminated many larger operations with greater resources but less adaptive flexibility. Eleanor's farm represented a successful model of small-scale agricultural sustainability that Sarah hoped to emulate if they could survive their current financial crisis and develop alternative income sources that could supplement traditional wheat production during periods when commodity markets made conventional farming unprofitable for family operations. Eleanor had diversified her agricultural activities to include organic vegetable production, heritage seed preservation, farm-to-table direct marketing, and agricultural education workshops that generated multiple revenue streams while maintaining soil health and environmental sustainability that ensured long-term operational viability even during adverse economic conditions. The borrowed crowbar had become symbolic of community solidarity and practical cooperation that made family farming possible during crisis periods when individual resources were insufficient for addressing complex problems requiring specialized tools, technical expertise, and collaborative labor that exceeded what single families could provide independently.
Eleanor's willingness to share equipment and knowledge represented the kind of mutual support that had enabled agricultural communities to survive economic pressures, environmental challenges, and technological transitions throughout American farming history. Lily's insistence on helping had led her to focus on areas that Sarah had designated as lower priority due to their location near the barn's exterior walls, where structural damage was less likely to affect essential equipment storage areas or operational functionality during immediate-term crisis management. But Lily's systematic approach to plank removal had been more thorough than Sarah's efficiency-focused methods, leading her to investigate construction details and foundation characteristics that revealed inconsistencies in construction techniques and material choices that couldn't be explained through normal construction variations or maintenance activities performed during the barn's documented operational history. When Lily's crowbar encountered unexpected resistance while attempting to remove what appeared to be a standard floor plank near the barn's northeast corner, her 13-year-old determination to complete assigned tasks according to her personal, analytical standards rather than adult efficiency requirements led her to apply additional leverage and investigative effort that revealed the plank wasn't attached to supporting structures in the same manner as surrounding floorboards. The resistance seemed to indicate that this particular plank was secured using different methods or served different structural purposes than normal flooring components, suggesting construction modifications that hadn't been documented in family records or reflected in the barn's apparent architectural history.
Lily's discovery would transform their desperate renovation project into an encounter with hidden history that connected their family ranch to legends, mysteries, and modern dangers that exceeded anything Sarah's military training or agricultural experience had prepared her to understand, manage, or survive effectively during circumstances that would test every survival skill, protective instinct, and decision-making capability that determined whether their family's agricultural heritage would continue or end with consequences that transcended their personal financial crisis to affect historical understanding and contemporary power structures whose stability depended on maintaining secrets that a 13-year-old's curiosity and crowbar were about to expose to forces that had been waiting over a century for exactly this discovery. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the morning stillness like a gunshot, making Sarah's heart race with the familiar anxiety that had characterized every moment of their financial crisis, when unexpected sounds meant additional expenses they couldn't afford or equipment failures that could eliminate their remaining operational capability. But Lily's excited voice calling from the northeast corner carried enthusiasm rather than distress, suggesting discovery rather than disaster, though Sarah's military experience had taught her that enthusiasm and danger often accompanied each other in situations where curiosity exceeded caution, and exploration led to consequences that transformed routine activities into life-altering events. "Mom, this isn't just a regular floorboard," Lily announced with the analytical precision that characterized her approach to problems requiring systematic investigation and logical reasoning. "The wood is different, and it's attached with metal brackets instead of nails, and there's something underneath that feels hollow when I tap it with the crowbar handle." Her description indicated construction techniques that differed significantly from standard barn flooring methods, suggesting modifications that had been made for specific purposes that weren't related to normal agricultural storage or operational requirements. Sarah approached Lily's location with the cautious assessment mindset that military training had developed for situations where anomalies might indicate hidden dangers or unexpected complications requiring immediate evaluation and appropriate response protocols. The northeast corner had been her lowest priority area due to its distance from essential equipment storage zones and its limited impact on operational functionality, but Lily's systematic investigation had revealed construction characteristics that challenged assumptions about the barn's historical purposes and architectural integrity. The floorboard that had resisted Lily's removal efforts was indeed secured using methods that differed from surrounding planks, with metal brackets and fastening techniques that appeared more sophisticated than typical 1920s barn construction would have required for standard agricultural applications. The wood itself showed characteristics that suggested different origins or treatment methods compared to the uniform lumber used throughout the rest of the floor system, indicating that this particular area had been modified or constructed during a different time period using materials and techniques that weren't consistent with the barn's documented construction history. But when Sarah applied her adult strength and leverage to assist Lily's removal efforts, the plank came free with sudden violence that revealed not the expected limestone foundation and support beam structure, but an opening that descended into darkness beyond the reach of their flashlight beams. The opening was precisely cut and deliberately constructed, with finished edges and reinforcement work that indicated skilled carpentry and engineering planning rather than natural formation or accidental structural failure that might have created similar access to underground spaces. The dimensions of the opening were too regular and purposeful to represent coincidental construction damage or foundation settling that had created gaps in the floor system. The edges showed tool marks and finishing work that indicated deliberate excavation and construction activities designed to create concealed access to underground areas while maintaining the appearance of normal barn flooring that would prevent casual discovery during routine agricultural operations or maintenance activities. Sarah's flashlight beam revealed stone steps descending approximately 8 feet below the barn's foundation level, constructed using limestone blocks that matched the building's foundation materials, but showing craftsmanship that exceeded typical foundation work in terms of precision, finish quality, and architectural sophistication. The steps were worn smooth by use patterns that indicated regular traffic over extended periods, suggesting that the underground access had been utilized frequently during some historical period when concealment was necessary, but operational requirements demanded continued access to whatever lay beneath their family's barn. The air rising from the opening carried scents that were inconsistent with normal basement or foundation spaces that might be expected beneath agricultural buildings. Instead of the musty dampness typical of underground areas that had been sealed for decades, the air showed circulation characteristics that indicated ventilation systems or connections to larger underground spaces that maintained atmospheric conditions suitable for extended human occupation or storage of materials requiring environmental protection.
Lily's analytical curiosity had been triggered by discovery that challenged everything she understood about their family property and its documented history, making her determined to investigate further despite Sarah's military-trained caution about entering unknown underground spaces that could contain structural hazards, environmental dangers, or security risks that exceeded their ability to assess safely without proper equipment and backup support. But Lily's argument that their desperate financial situation required them to investigate any discovery that might provide solutions to their survival crisis carried logic that Sarah couldn't dismiss when conventional options had been exhausted and foreclosure proceedings would eliminate their family heritage within weeks. The stone construction visible from the opening showed engineering capabilities that exceeded typical frontier construction techniques available during the barn's documented construction period in 1923, suggesting that the underground access had been created earlier or by builders with specialized knowledge and skills that weren't characteristic of standard agricultural construction in Montana during the early 20th century. The stonework displayed architectural influences that seemed more consistent with European masonry traditions or specialized construction techniques that wouldn't typically be found in rural American agricultural buildings in Montana. Sarah's military engineering background had provided training in structural assessment and safety evaluation for underground facilities, making her capable of recognizing that the stone construction and engineering visible from the opening represented professional quality work that had been designed for permanent use rather than temporary concealment or emergency shelter applications. The construction quality suggested significant investment of time, resources, and specialized expertise that exceeded what would be justified for normal agricultural storage or operational purposes. But Lily had already begun descent of the stone steps with the fearless confidence that 13-year-old personalities often displayed when curiosity overwhelmed adult caution and safety considerations, forcing Sarah to follow immediately to provide protection and supervision for exploration activities that could reveal important information about their property while potentially exposing them to unknown dangers that required adult assessment and crisis management capabilities. The underground passage extended horizontally from the bottom of the stone steps,
constructed using the same limestone masonry techniques with barrel arch ceilings that demonstrated sophisticated engineering knowledge and construction capabilities that were inconsistent with frontier building methods typically available in Montana during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The passage dimensions were sufficient for comfortable adult movement while maintaining structural integrity that had preserved the underground space throughout decades of Montana freeze-thaw cycles and soil movement that typically damaged underground construction in the region. The passage walls showed no evidence of moisture infiltration or structural deterioration that would be expected in underground spaces that had been abandoned for extended periods without maintenance or environmental controls. Instead, the stonework remained dry and stable, with mortar joints that showed minimal deterioration and surfaces that suggested ongoing environmental protection through ventilation systems or construction techniques that prevented typical underground deterioration patterns. Lily's flashlight beam revealed that the passage extended beyond their light range, curving slightly to the right in a direction that would lead toward the property's eastern boundary, where limestone outcroppings provided natural geographical features that could conceal underground construction from external observation. The passage floor was paved with fitted stone blocks that showed wear patterns indicating regular use over extended periods, while the walls displayed tool marks and construction details that suggested the underground space had been excavated and constructed using professional mining or tunneling techniques rather than simple manual excavation methods. The air quality within the passage remained surprisingly fresh despite the underground location and apparent age of the construction, indicating ventilation systems that continue to function effectively or connections to larger underground spaces that maintained atmospheric circulation through natural or mechanical means. The temperature remained constant despite external weather conditions, suggesting thermal regulation capabilities that exceeded what would be expected from simple underground construction without sophisticated environmental controls. But the most remarkable discovery was evidence that the underground passage had been used recently, with footprints in accumulated dust patterns indicating human traffic within months rather than years or decades since the last access. The footprint evidence suggested that multiple individuals had used the passage regularly with traffic patterns that indicated systematic exploration or operational activities rather than casual curiosity or historical investigation that might be expected from occasional visitors to abandoned underground spaces.
Sarah's military intelligence training had developed her ability to interpret physical evidence and assess security implications of discoveries that might indicate ongoing activities by unknown individuals with purposes that could affect her family's safety and property security. The recent use evidence transformed their historical curiosity into immediate security concerns that required careful evaluation of whether their exploration had exposed them to current dangers rather than simply revealing past secrets about their property's hidden history. The passage construction showed characteristics that reminded Sarah of military engineering projects designed for concealment and security rather than civilian construction intended for normal operational or storage purposes. The entrance concealment, structural sophistication, and ongoing maintenance evidence suggested that the underground space served contemporary purposes that required secrecy and restricted access, making their accidental discovery potentially threatening to individuals or organizations whose activities depended on preventing public knowledge of whatever lay beyond the range of their flashlight beams. Lily had continued exploration with characteristic determination, her smaller size and natural curiosity making her more comfortable with underground movement than Sarah, whose military experience in confined spaces had been limited to training scenarios rather than operational requirements. But Lily's exploration had revealed additional construction features that indicated the passage was part of a larger underground system rather than a simple tunnel connecting two locations, suggesting engineering planning and resource investment that exceeded anything justified by normal concealment or security requirements. The passage walls showed evidence of electrical installation points where wiring had been mounted using techniques that indicated professional electrical work rather than improvised lighting systems that might be expected in hidden underground construction. The electrical evidence suggested that the underground space had been equipped for regular use, with modern conveniences and safety systems that required ongoing maintenance and operational support from people with technical expertise and access to electrical supplies and equipment. But the electrical installation evidence also indicated that the underground system remained operational, rather than simply representing historical construction that had been abandoned when concealment was no longer necessary. Fresh wire installation and recent electrical work suggested that whatever purposes the underground space served continued to require modern electrical power and communication capabilities that connected the hidden facilities to external power sources, and possibly to communication networks that enabled coordination with surface activities or other underground installations. Sarah's assessment of the electrical evidence revealed installation techniques and equipment types that suggested professional electrical work performed within recent years, rather than historical installation that had been maintained through simple repairs and updates. The electrical system showed characteristics consistent with computer networking and communication equipment, rather than simple lighting and ventilation support, indicating that the underground space supported sophisticated technological activities that required reliable power and data transmission capabilities. As Lily's exploration continued deeper into the passage system, her excited voice echoed back with descriptions of additional chambers and construction features that challenged everything Sarah thought she understood about their family property and its historical purposes. The underground system was revealing itself to be far more extensive and sophisticated than a simple concealment tunnel, with engineering complexity and ongoing operational characteristics that suggested contemporary use for purposes that required significant financial investment and technological infrastructure. The realization that their desperate barn renovation had led to discovery of an active underground facility operated by unknown individuals transformed their financial crisis into a security emergency that required immediate decision-making about whether to continue exploration that could provide solutions to their survival needs or retreat from involvement in activities that could threaten their family's safety through contact with people whose purposes require maintaining absolute secrecy about underground operations beneath Montana agricultural property. Lily's voice carried increasing excitement as her exploration revealed evidence that their accidental discovery connected to historical mysteries and contemporary secrets that exceeded anything their family crisis had prepared them to understand or manage, while simultaneously offering possibilities for solutions to their financial desperation through discoveries that could transform their desperate situation into opportunities that transcended their wildest expectations about what their property renovation project might reveal about hidden treasures and concealed activities that had been operating beneath their family farm for over a century.
The passage curved sharply to the right after approximately 50 feet of straight tunnel construction, revealing an architectural transition that marked the boundary between the access tunnel and what appeared to be a much larger underground complex whose scale and sophistication challenged every assumption Sarah had developed about the construction capabilities and financial resources that would have been available to whoever had built this hidden facility beneath their family ranch during the late 19th or early 20th centuries. The curve had been engineered with precision that indicated professional surveying and construction planning rather than improvised excavation, suggesting that the underground system had been designed according to comprehensive architectural plans that considered drainage, ventilation, structural integrity, and concealment requirements that exceeded typical frontier construction capabilities. Beyond the curve, Lily's flashlight beam revealed a chamber that eliminated any possibility of rational explanation based on conventional understanding of their property's historical development and agricultural purposes. The space was enormous, approximately 40 feet in diameter and 15 feet in height, carved from solid limestone bedrock with engineering precision that required advanced excavation technology and construction expertise that shouldn't have been available in rural Montana during the supposed construction period. The chamber walls had been finished with fitted stone blocks that displayed craftsmanship comparable to European cathedral construction or ancient Roman architectural achievements, representing skill levels and resource investment that exceeded anything justified by concealment or storage requirements for typical frontier activities. The chamber's floor was paved with intricate mosaic patterns created from colored stone that had been imported from geographical locations hundreds or thousands of miles from Montana, indicating transportation logistics and financial resources that contradicted assumptions about the economic limitations and technological capabilities of whoever had constructed this underground facility. The mosaic work showed artistic influences that combined Native American geometric patterns with European decorative traditions and mining industry symbolism in ways that suggested cultural collaboration rather than simple appropriation or conquest relationships between different groups involved in the facility's construction and operation. But the chamber's most remarkable feature was its ceiling, which displayed astronomical mapping that depicted celestial configurations with mathematical accuracy that required advanced observational capabilities and computational skills that weren't typically available to frontier communities or mining operations during the late 19th century. The astronomical charts showed star positions, planetary movements, and celestial cycles with precision that matched contemporary scientific observations, while incorporating mathematical relationships and geometric patterns that indicated understanding of advanced astronomical concepts that frontier science and engineering hadn't developed until much later periods. The astronomical ceiling work wasn't simple decoration, but functional mapping that appeared to serve navigational or timing purposes related to whatever activities the underground facility had been designed to support. The mathematical precision and scientific accuracy suggested that the facility's builders possessed educational backgrounds and technical capabilities that exceeded typical frontier expertise, indicating involvement of individuals with formal scientific training or access to advanced technical knowledge that wouldn't normally be available in remote agricultural areas during the territorial period. Lily stood in the center of this impossible space, her 13-year-old analytical mind processing architectural and engineering achievements that challenged fundamental assumptions about historical timelines, technological development patterns, and resource availability during the period when the underground facility must have been constructed. Her excitement was palpable as she documented construction details and decorative elements with photographs and detailed observations that demonstrated investigation skills and attention to detail that would have impressed professional archaeologists or historical researchers. "Mom, this isn't just a hiding place," Lily announced with characteristic analytical precision. "This is like an underground palace or temple or something that somebody spent years building with really expensive materials and professional construction techniques. Look at how perfect everything is, and how the stonework matches exactly, and how the ceiling calculations are so precise that they must have used instruments and mathematical knowledge that most people didn't have back then." Her assessment was accurate and disturbing in its implications for understanding who had possessed the resources, expertise, and motivation to construct such an elaborate underground facility beneath what was supposedly marginal agricultural land during the territorial period. The construction quality and artistic sophistication indicated involvement of people with significant financial resources, advanced technical knowledge, and long-term planning capabilities that suggested purposes far more complex than simple concealment or temporary storage of valuable items during periods of civil unrest or economic instability.
The chamber contained additional features that revealed its purposes extended beyond impressive architectural display to practical operational requirements for extended human occupation and specialized activities that required environmental controls and sophisticated infrastructure. Ventilation shafts concealed within decorative stonework provided fresh air circulation through natural convection systems that maintained optimal atmospheric conditions without mechanical equipment, while drainage channels integrated into the floor design prevented moisture accumulation and flooding during seasonal groundwater fluctuations that could have compromised underground operations. The environmental engineering demonstrated understanding of geological conditions, seasonal water table variations, and atmospheric circulation principles that indicated involvement of people with formal engineering education or extensive practical experience in underground construction projects. The technical sophistication suggested that the facility's designers possessed knowledge of mining engineering, architectural principles, and environmental systems that weren't typically available to frontier communities or agricultural operations during the supposed construction period. But Lilly's systematic exploration had revealed hidden compartments and concealed chambers that transformed the impressive architectural display into evidence of activities and purposes that connected their accidental discovery to historical events and contemporary implications that exceeded anything their family's financial crisis had prepared them to comprehend or manage safely. Behind decorative stone panels that appeared to be permanent architectural elements, pressure-activated mechanisms revealed storage areas that contained materials and documents that challenged established historical narratives about territorial development, law enforcement, and economic relationships during Montana's frontier period. The first concealed chamber contained a collection of weapons that displayed craftsmanship and technological sophistication that were inconsistent with typical frontier firearms and equipment available during the late 19th century. The weapons included custom-manufactured rifles with precision engineering and metallurgical quality that exceeded standard military or civilian firearms production capabilities, along with ammunition and accessories that indicated access to advanced manufacturing facilities and specialized technical expertise that weren't available through normal commercial channels during the territorial period. The weapons showed evidence of regular maintenance and care that indicated they had been preserved for operational use rather than simple historical collection or ceremonial display purposes. The preservation quality suggested that the underground facility had been accessed regularly by people with technical knowledge and resources necessary to maintain complex mechanical equipment in operational condition throughout decades of storage in underground environmental conditions that typically cause deterioration and malfunction in firearms and metallic equipment. But the weapons were merely the beginning of evidence that documented activities and relationships that challenged every assumption about law enforcement, territorial governance, and economic development during Montana's transition from territorial status to statehood. Additional concealed chambers contained documents that proved the underground facility had served as an operational headquarters for systematic criminal activities that involved collaboration between supposed law enforcement officials, territorial government administrators, and business leaders whose public reputations contradicted their documented involvement in organized theft, murder, and corruption that had shaped Montana's early economic and political development. The documents were written on high-quality paper, using professional printing and handwriting techniques that indicated formal education and institutional resources, rather than the crude materials and methods that would be expected from typical frontier criminal organizations. The correspondence included official letterheads, government seals, and corporate stamps that proved the criminal activities had been coordinated through legitimate institutional channels rather than operating outside established legal and business frameworks that governed territorial development and economic expansion. A letter dated September 14, 1889, bore the official seal of the Montana Territorial Governor,
alongside signatures from railroad executives, federal marshals, and territorial judges whose names appear in official historical records as respected law enforcement officials and business leaders rather than the criminal conspirators that these documents prove them to be. The correspondence discussed systematic theft of federal gold shipments that were being transported by railroad through Montana territory, with detailed planning for robbery operations that would blame the thefts on outlaw gangs while protecting the actual perpetrators who held official positions in territorial government and law enforcement agencies.
The September 1889 document revealed that Blackjack Sullivan, whose legendary criminal career had been documented in newspaper accounts and dime novels throughout the late 19th century, had actually been a federal undercover operative whose supposed outlaw activities provided cover for investigating corruption within territorial law enforcement and railroad operations. Sullivan's assignment involved infiltrating criminal networks and documenting evidence of systematic theft and murder that involved collaboration between railroad executives, territorial officials, and federal marshals who were using their official positions to coordinate large-scale robbery operations while maintaining public reputations as law-abiding leaders. But the correspondence also revealed that Sullivan's undercover operation had been discovered by the corrupt officials he was investigating, leading to a conspiracy to eliminate him while using his death as a convenient conclusion to the outlaw legend that provided cover for their continued criminal activities. The documents showed that Sullivan's supposed execution in 1889 had been staged through collaboration between territorial judges and federal marshals who had arranged for his escape and relocation while spreading false reports of his death that would end public interest in his activities and prevent further investigation of the corruption he had been documenting. The staged execution documents included detailed financial arrangements between territorial officials and railroad executives who had paid substantial bribes to ensure Sullivan's elimination as a threat to their criminal operations. The payments were documented through bank transfer records and promissory notes that proved the corruption extended beyond simple theft to systematic purchasing of judicial decisions, law enforcement cooperation, and political influence that had shaped territorial governance and economic development according to criminal rather than legitimate interests. A subsequent document, dated October 3, 1889, discussed Sullivan's successful escape and his establishment of the underground facility beneath what would later become the Whitfield Ranch as a secure location for preserving evidence of territorial corruption, while maintaining capabilities for continued investigation and documentation of criminal activities that involved multiple territorial institutions and economic organizations. The facility had been designed to serve as both preservation repository and operational headquarters for ongoing intelligence gathering about corruption that extended throughout territorial government and business leadership. The October document revealed that Sullivan had been assisted in his escape and facility construction by a network of federal investigators and honest territorial officials who were working to expose and eliminate the corruption that had compromised law enforcement and judicial systems throughout Montana Territory. The network included railroad workers, mining engineers, government clerks, and business operators who provided intelligence about criminal activities while maintaining their official positions and public reputations to avoid suspicion from the corrupt officials they were investigating. But the most shocking revelation was evidence that the corruption and criminal activities had continued long after territorial status ended and Montana achieved statehood, evolving into contemporary institutional arrangements that maintained the same objectives and methods while adapting to changing political and economic circumstances.
Documents from the early 20th century showed that the network of corrupt officials and business leaders had established modern corporations, banks, and governmental agencies that continued the systematic theft and political manipulation that had characterized their territorial operations. The 20th century correspondence revealed that major infrastructure projects throughout Montana, including railroad expansion, mining operations, and agricultural development programs, had been financed through theft of federal funds and manipulation of land grants that were supposed to support legitimate economic development but were actually diverted to private enrichment of the same families and business interests that had been involved in the original territorial corruption. The criminal network had adapted their methods to contemporary legal and business frameworks while preserving their core objectives of wealth accumulation through institutional position and political influence. Sullivan's preserved records included detailed financial documentation showing that millions of dollars in federal gold, land grants, and development funds had been systematically stolen throughout Montana's territorial and early statehood periods, with the stolen resources used to establish family fortunes and business empires that continued to dominate Montana's economy and politics into the contemporary period. The financial scale represented wealth accumulation that had shaped Montana's economic development and political structures according to criminal rather than legitimate business activities or democratic governance.
The evidence showed that prominent Montana families whose names appeared on banks, corporations, and governmental institutions throughout the state had inherited wealth and political influence that originated from systematic theft and corruption, rather than legitimate business success or public service that their official biographies claimed as the foundation of their social status and economic power. The documented theft included federal funds intended for infrastructure development, Native American treaty payments, military payroll, and territorial administrative expenses that had been diverted to private enrichment rather than their intended public purposes. But Sullivan's documentation also revealed that resistance to the corruption had continued throughout the 20th century through networks of investigators, honest officials, and community leaders who had worked to preserve evidence and prepare for opportunities to expose the institutional theft and political manipulation that had shaped Montana's development. The resistance networks had maintained surveillance of the corrupt institutions while preserving documentation that could support legal proceedings when political circumstances permitted challenges to entrench corruption and criminal influence over governmental and business institutions. The underground facility had served as a central coordination point for the resistance networks, with communication systems and document preservation capabilities that had enabled decades of intelligence gathering and evidence compilation despite the power and influence of the corrupt institutions being investigated. The facility's design and operational security had protected resistance activities from detection, while maintaining capabilities for expanding documentation and coordination as the investigation revealed additional evidence of criminal activities and institutional corruption. Contemporary documents showed that the resistance networks had identified specific individuals and organizations that continued the criminal traditions established during the territorial period, with evidence that could support federal prosecution for fraud, theft, and corruption involving hundreds of millions of dollars in contemporary values. The evidence included banking records, corporate documents, and governmental communications that proved ongoing criminal activities affecting federal programs, state agencies, and private institutions throughout Montana and the broader Rocky Mountain region. As Sarah examined documents that revealed the true scope of what Lily's curiosity had uncovered, she began to understand that their desperate barn renovation had connected them to criminal conspiracies that had been ongoing for over a century and involved contemporary institutions whose power and influence could threaten anyone who discovered evidence of their historical and ongoing criminal activities. The documents proved that Blackjack Sullivan's treasure wasn't simple stolen gold,
but comprehensive evidence of institutional corruption that could destroy family fortunes, political careers, and business empires whose wealth and authority depended on preventing public knowledge of their criminal origins and contemporary criminal activities. The treasure cave that lay beyond the chamber represented not just financial salvation for their family crisis, but legal evidence that could trigger fundamental changes in Montana's political and economic structures while exposing criminal activities that affected federal programs, state governance, and business relationships throughout the region. Their accidental discovery had connected them to secrets whose value transcended simple monetary worth to encompass justice, historical truth, and contemporary political accountability that powerful interests had spent over a century ensuring remained hidden beneath Montana rangeland, where missing persons cases involving curious investigators rarely receive sufficient attention to threaten institutional security and criminal immunity. The electronic monitoring systems that had been concealed within the underground facility's stonework for the past 48 hours had been transmitting detailed surveillance data through satellite communication networks to coordination centers operated by organizations whose resources and authority transcended normal governmental or corporate capabilities, documenting every document that Sarah and Lily had examined, every photograph they had taken, and every discovery they had made while exploring chambers that contained evidence capable of destroying institutional legitimacy and family fortunes that had been built through systematic criminal activities spanning multiple generations of Montana's political and economic leadership. Dr. Victoria Ashford's voice emerged from communication equipment that had activated automatically when their exploration triggered proximity sensors hidden within the facility's architectural elements, speaking with the diplomatic authority of someone accustomed to managing complex situations requiring coordination between multiple agencies, unlimited financial resources, and legal immunity that exceeded normal law enforcement capabilities. Mrs. Whitfield, my name is Dr. Victoria Ashford, and I represent the Rocky Mountain Historical Preservation Society, which has been monitoring your family situation since your unfortunate discovery of materials that require careful handling to prevent misunderstanding about their historical significance and contemporary legal implications that could affect established institutional relationships and economic structures throughout the western United States.
The formal introduction eliminated any possibility that external contact had occurred through coincidence or casual observation of their underground exploration activities. Dr. Ashford's comprehensive knowledge of their specific discoveries and her immediate availability for direct communication indicated surveillance capabilities and response coordination that exceeded anything Sarah had encountered during her military intelligence training, suggesting organizational resources that operated independently of normal governmental oversight or legal accountability mechanisms that typically govern surveillance and communication interception activities. We represent institutions that have been preserving 19th-century artifacts and territorial period documents for over a century, ensuring that historically significant materials receive proper academic study and legal protection while preventing their exploitation by individuals or organizations who might attempt to use cultural heritage items for contemporary political purposes that could destabilize regional economic relationships and governmental structures that have evolved to protect the interests of all parties involved in complex territorial and resource management issues that affect multiple states and federal agencies, Dr. Ashford continued, her language carrying diplomatic precision that acknowledged their discoveries while reframing them as academic curiosities rather than legal evidence with contemporary implications for criminal prosecution and institutional accountability. The communication system's activation revealed that the underground facility had been under comprehensive surveillance since their initial discovery, with audio and video monitoring that had documented their conversations, recorded their reactions to specific discoveries, and transmitted real-time intelligence to coordination centers that possessed authority to make immediate decisions about response protocols and resource deployment affecting their family's safety and the disposition of evidence that could affect ongoing federal investigations and institutional security requirements.
The surveillance wasn't hostile reconnaissance, but protective monitoring designed to assess whether their family represented security threats requiring elimination or potential assets who could be recruited into collaborative relationships that would benefit all parties while maintaining operational security for activities that transcended normal governmental or corporate oversight capabilities. The materials you've discovered represent one of several preservation repositories that were established during the territorial period to protect Indigenous cultural heritage and frontier historical documents from destruction during periods of political instability and territorial transitions that affected governmental continuity and institutional memory throughout the Western expansion period, Dr. Ashford explained, apparently receiving real-time updates about their activities through monitoring systems that Lilly had inadvertently activated while photographing documents and artifacts in hidden chambers containing evidence of institutional corruption and criminal activities spanning multiple generations of Montana's political and economic development. But Sarah's military intelligence background had developed her ability to recognize institutional deception and propaganda techniques designed to reframe threatening situations as beneficial opportunities, making her immediately suspicious of explanations that portrayed discovery of centuries-old criminal conspiracy documentation and federal gold theft evidence as simple cultural preservation rather than legal proof of systematic institutional fraud and contemporary criminal activities that continue through modern governmental and corporate structures. Dr. Ashford's careful language suggested institutional coordination and legal preparation that indicated powerful organizations possessed comprehensive strategies for managing situations where their concealed operations were discovered by individuals who lacked sufficient knowledge or resources to challenge their authority effectively. The timing of contact was too precise to represent normal academic or legal response to historical discoveries, suggesting monitoring organizations possessed real-time intelligence gathering and rapid response capabilities that could coordinate multiple agencies and deploy specialized personnel within hours of threat detection. The coordination required sophisticated communication networks, pre-positioned response teams, and authority relationships that transcended normal governmental and corporate structures, indicating that the organizations operated with resources and legal immunity that exceeded anything available through conventional institutional arrangements that govern normal historical preservation and academic research activities. However, Dr. Ashford continued, recent developments in federal oversight of archaeological sites and territorial historical preservation have created legal complications that require immediate relocation of sensitive materials to secure facilities where they can receive proper academic study and legal protection from exploitation by unauthorized individuals or organizations who might attempt to use cultural heritage materials for purposes that could compromise their historical integrity and contemporary legal status under federal preservation legislation and international cultural protection agreements.
The reference to federal oversight suggested that governmental agencies had become aware of the organization's activities and were conducting investigations that threatened to expose operational security and legal arrangements that had been maintained in secrecy for over a century. The need for immediate relocation indicated that the underground facility was being abandoned as part of comprehensive security protocols designed to prevent federal agencies from accessing evidence that could support criminal prosecution or expose organizational involvement in systematic resource theft and territorial control activities throughout the western United States. But the communication from what appeared to be competing intelligence networks had provided context that reframed Dr. Ashford's diplomatic language as threats disguised as protective offers. Sarah's military communication training had developed her ability to recognize coded language and institutional coordination patterns that indicated the involvement of multiple organizations with conflicting objectives regarding their family's fate and the disposition of materials that could affect territorial claims, criminal prosecutions, and institutional legitimacy worth hundreds of billions of dollars in contemporary political and economic influence. A second voice joined the communication, introducing himself as Colonel Marcus Reed, whose military bearing and tactical language indicated professional experience with operations requiring coordination between civilian agencies and military resources for situations that transcended normal law enforcement capabilities and legal authority structures. Mrs. Whitfield, your military background provides you with security awareness that allows us to discuss these matters with appropriate frankness about operational realities and security requirements that civilian families typically cannot understand or manage effectively without comprehensive protection and institutional support that exceeds normal governmental assistance programs. Colonel Reed's approach suggested recruitment rather than threats, indicating that organizations had evaluated Sarah's military background and determined that her training and experience made her a valuable potential asset rather than simply a security threat requiring elimination. His reference to operational realities acknowledged that their discovery had connected them to activities and conflicts that exceeded normal civilian experience, while suggesting that cooperation with his organization could provide benefits and protection that other alternatives could not offer safely or effectively. The materials you've discovered are protected under federal legislation that classifies unauthorized access as violations of national security statutes that carry mandatory imprisonment sentences. By your inadvertent discovery and lack of intent to compromise security operations provides opportunities for collaborative arrangements that could benefit your family while protecting sensitive operations that serve essential national security interests and regional stability requirements, Colonel Reed explained, his language balancing legal threats with recruitment opportunities that suggested their family's cooperation was preferred but not absolutely necessary for achieving organizational objectives. The underground facility's communication systems had been joined by a third participant whose voice carried different characteristics that suggested academic rather than military or governmental organizational affiliation, speaking with professorial authority about historical significance and legal complexities that exceeded typical institutional responses to archaeological discoveries or historical document authentication. Mrs. Whitfield, my name's Professor Jonathan Blackwood from the Western Territories Historical Research Institute, and I've been following your family's discoveries with great interest from both academic and legal perspectives that could benefit significantly from your cooperation with comprehensive documentation and authentication processes. Professor Blackwood's involvement indicated that academic institutions had become aware of their discoveries and were preparing scholarly responses that could either support or undermine the legal and political implications of evidence that proved institutional corruption and criminal activities spanning over a century of Montana's political and economic development. His reference to comprehensive documentation and authentication suggested academic processes that could establish the historical legitimacy and legal admissibility of evidence while potentially providing legitimate scholarly protection from organizational retaliation and legal prosecution.
But the communication had been interrupted by a fourth participant whose voice carried different authority patterns that suggested Indigenous rather than European cultural background and organizational affiliations, speaking with political urgency about territorial sovereignty and legal rights that had been violated through systematic theft and institutional corruption, documented in the materials that Lily's exploration had discovered. Sarah, my name is Dr. Maria Crowfeather, and I represent the Confederation of Indigenous Nations Legal Advocacy Center, which has been monitoring institutional activities affecting tribal territorial rights and preparing legal challenges to unauthorized occupation of traditional territories and systematic exploitation of cultural resources throughout the Northern Rocky Mountain region. Dr. Crowfeather's introduction revealed that the communication system connected to networks representing interests that could benefit from exposure of institutional corruption and historical documents that proved systematic theft of federal treaty payments and land grants that were intended to fulfill governmental obligations to tribal nations throughout Montana Territory, with financial records proving that millions of dollars in tribal trust funds were diverted to private enrichment rather than their intended purposes for reservation development and educational programs. Dr. Crowfeather explained, her language carrying legal precision combined with political urgency that indicated extensive preparation for exactly these circumstances and comprehensive legal strategies that could benefit from authentication and public disclosure of the discovered evidence. The competing explanations created impossible choices between organizations whose resources and capabilities exceeded anything that individual families could evaluate effectively without extensive legal representation and intelligence support that could protect their interests while navigating conflicts between powerful institutions whose centuries-old disputes had evolved into contemporary struggles over territorial sovereignty, resource extraction rights, and legal authority that affected economic and political relationships throughout multiple states and federal jurisdictions. Colonel Reed's response indicated that organizational monitoring had detected communication from competing networks, triggering security protocols that eliminated diplomatic approaches in favor of direct action designed to secure the family and materials before alternative organizations could implement extraction or legal protection measures that would compromise institutional security and operational objectives. Mrs. Whitfield, the situation has become complicated by unauthorized involvement of organizations whose political objectives could compromise your family's safety and legal status. We are implementing immediate extraction protocols that will provide secure transportation to facilities where you can receive comprehensive briefings about your options while remaining protected from groups whose intentions may not align with your family's interests or safety requirements. The language shift from collaborative offers to extraction protocols indicated that response had escalated from recruitment to containment operations that would secure the family regardless of their preferences or willingness to cooperate with institutional objectives. The military terminology suggested that Colonel Reed possessed authority to deploy resources that could overcome resistance from family members or competing organizations whose intervention might complicate operational security and material recovery objectives that transcended individual family interests in favor of institutional requirements and national security considerations. But Dr. Crowfeather's communication had provided tactical information that revealed organizational response patterns and timing constraints that could be exploited through immediate action before security teams could establish operational control over the underground facility and surrounding territory. Sarah, extraction teams representing institutional interests are approximately 30 minutes from your location, but our legal networks have prepared emergency judicial protection orders that can establish federal court oversight of the situation while providing immediate legal representation and protection services that exceed anything other organizations can offer through their controlled custody arrangements. The competing extraction offers created tactical dilemmas that required immediate decisions based on incomplete information about organizational capabilities, legal authorities, and long-term consequences that could affect Lily's entire future development within contexts that neither military training nor civilian experience had prepared Sarah to evaluate effectively without extensive legal representation and intelligence support that could protect their interests while navigating conflicts between powerful institutions whose centuries-old disputes had evolved into contemporary struggles over territorial sovereignty, resource extraction rights, and legal authority that affected economic and political relationships throughout multiple states and federal jurisdictions.
Lily's continued exploration had uncovered additional communication equipment that revealed the full scope of organizations monitoring their situation, including federal agencies whose involvement indicated that governmental authorities had become aware of institutional activities and were conducting investigations that could result in criminal prosecutions affecting all parties involved in disputes over territorial sovereignty, resource extraction rights, and institutional accountability for systematic theft and corruption spanning multiple generations of political and economic leadership throughout the Rocky Mountain region. The electronic surveillance data being transmitted to multiple agencies created permanent records that could support legal proceedings regardless of whether their family cooperated with specific organizations or attempted to maintain neutrality in conflicts between institutions whose resources and authority exceeded individual capacity for resistance or independent action.
Their knowledge of sensitive materials and organizational operations had made them permanent participants in conflicts that would continue for years or decades through legal, political, and economic mechanisms that affected territorial sovereignty and institutional legitimacy throughout multiple Western states and federal jurisdictions. Professor Blackwood's voice carried increasing urgency as monitoring systems detected approaching response teams from multiple organizations whose coordination suggested either collaborative operations or competitive conflicts that could result in confrontation over custody of the family and control of materials that could affect academic understanding, legal proceedings, and political accountability throughout the region. Mrs. Whitfield, the historical significance of your discoveries transcends immediate political considerations to encompass fundamental questions about American territorial development and institutional legitimacy that require scholarly documentation and academic protection from political exploitation or institutional suppression that could eliminate crucial evidence about frontier corruption and territorial governance that affects contemporary understanding of Western expansion and governmental accountability throughout the region. As Sarah monitored communications between competing organizations whose representatives were coordinating response operations while simultaneously preparing for potential conflicts over custody of her family and control of materials that could affect territorial claims worth hundreds of billions of dollars in contemporary political and economic influence, she realized that their desperate barn renovation had connected them to institutional conflicts that had been ongoing for over a century between Indigenous nations, federal agencies, academic institutions, and criminal organizations that continued to operate through contemporary governmental and corporate structures while maintaining their fundamental objectives of controlling Western territories and resources through legal and economic mechanisms that could be challenged successfully only through evidence that Lily's curiosity had accidentally discovered. The communication systems were receiving updates that indicated multiple extraction teams had accelerated their deployment schedules and would arrive within 15 minutes with authorization and equipment to secure the facility and its occupants, regardless of resistance from competing organizations or federal agencies whose legal authority was insufficient to challenge operations that were protected through centuries-old agreements and contemporary institutional arrangements that transcended normal governmental oversight and judicial review processes that applied to conventional corporate and organizational activities affecting regional development and resource management. The sound of approaching helicopters thundered across the Montana rangeland like mechanical harbingers of forces whose resources could reshape their family's existence within minutes, making Sarah realize that philosophical deliberation about competing organizational loyalties had become a luxury she could no longer afford when tactical survival required immediate action based on incomplete information about institutions whose centuries-old conflicts had converged on Lily's future, and their accidental discovery of evidence that could trigger legal battles affecting territorial sovereignty throughout the Western United States. Lily stood beside Sullivan's preserved documents with 13-year-old determination that transcended adult paralysis in crisis situations. Her analytical capabilities focused on practical solutions rather than abstract moral dilemmas about institutional authority and legal legitimacy that had been designed to obscure simple realities about power, control, and family autonomy in situations where competing institutions sought to manage threats to their authority through recruitment, containment, or elimination strategies that subordinated individual interests to organizational objectives that had been maintained through systematic deception for over a century. "Mom, they're all trying to control us because we found proof they've been lying about history and stealing money that belonged to other people. But we don't have to let any of them take us anywhere we don't want to go if we're smart about using what we know," Lily declared with clarity that cut through the diplomatic complexity that had been designed to confuse families into accepting institutional control, rather than exercising their rights to legal representation and public disclosure of criminal evidence that could benefit society, while protecting their autonomy and safety through visibility rather than secrecy.
Her daughter's insight identified the fundamental reality that adult analysis had overlooked. The evidence they had discovered represented power that could protect them through public exposure rather than making them vulnerable to institutional retaliation, transforming them from victims of organizational conflicts into agents of historical justice whose knowledge could benefit humanity while providing protection through transparency that made covert elimination impossible for institutions whose authority depended on maintaining operational secrecy and public ignorance about their criminal activities and historical deception. Dr. Crowfeather's voice carried renewed urgency as monitoring systems detected approaching extraction teams whose timeline had accelerated to immediate deployment with military coordination that indicated institutional cooperation rather than competition for custody of evidence that could affect multiple legal proceedings and political accountability processes throughout the region. Sarah, you have less than 10 minutes before institutional security establishes perimeter control and prevents alternative legal protection options. Our tribal legal teams have prepared federal court filings that will trigger governmental protection protocols and judicial oversight, but only if you can maintain physical custody of Sullivan's documentation long enough for legal proceedings to establish court authority over the situation and evidence authentication. But Sarah's military experience had taught her that legal protection was meaningless without tactical advantages that could prevent hostile forces from achieving operational objectives before judicial processes could establish effective oversight and constitutional protections. The approaching organizations possessed resources and authority that exceeded normal law enforcement capabilities, making legal filings inadequate protection against institutions whose operations transcended conventional governmental jurisdiction and legal accountability mechanisms that govern typical criminal investigations and evidence preservation procedures. The communication systems revealed that federal agencies had been conducting parallel investigations of institutional activities and had prepared their own response teams, but governmental intervention would result in extended legal proceedings that could separate their family for months or years while courts determined custody arrangements and evidence authentication processes that would subject Lily to institutional control that might prove more restrictive than any alternative arrangements offered by competing organizations whose interests aligned more closely with family autonomy and historical justice. Lily had been exploring additional features of Sullivan's communication equipment while adults debated organizational authority, discovering broadcast capabilities that connected directly to internet networks and social media platforms rather than institutional communication systems monitored by competing intelligence operations and governmental surveillance programs. Mom, there's a way to share everything we found with everyone at once so that none of these groups can hide it anymore or make us disappear. But once we do that, we can never go back to normal life because everyone will know about us and what we discovered. Her daughter had identified the option that military tactical analysis had failed to consider, transforming themselves from targets of institutional conflicts into public figures whose knowledge could benefit society while providing protection through visibility that made covert elimination impossible for organizations whose authority depended on maintaining historical narratives and operational secrecy that public exposure would destroy permanently. Broadcasting their discoveries would expose centuries-old institutional deception while simultaneously documenting criminal activities and territorial theft that academic consensus and legal frameworks had systematically excluded from historical understanding and contemporary accountability processes. The tactical implications were profound and irreversible. Public exposure would provide protection from organizational elimination while creating opportunities to contribute to legal and political processes that could restore justice and historical accuracy throughout the Western United States. But visibility would eliminate privacy, autonomy, and normal family life in favor of permanent roles as historical witnesses whose testimony could affect institutional legitimacy and territorial sovereignty involving hundreds of billions of dollars in contemporary political and economic influence. Dr. Ashford's communication had detected their discussion of broadcast options, triggering final ultimatum protocols that eliminated diplomatic approaches in favor of direct threats designed to prevent public exposure that could compromise institutional operations and legal arrangements that had been maintained through secrecy and political influence for over a century. Mrs. Whitfield, unauthorized disclosure of classified historical materials would constitute violations of federal security legislation that carry mandatory life imprisonment sentences for adults and permanent governmental custody for minor children whose parents have demonstrated inability to protect institutional security interests and regional stability requirements.
But Lilly had already activated Sullivan's broadcasting systems that connected to global internet networks, news organizations, and social media platforms throughout the world, beginning real-time transmission of high-definition images showing the criminal correspondence, financial theft documentation, and territorial fraud evidence that would provide permanent proof of institutional deception and systematic theft that could not be suppressed through organizational influence over governmental agencies, academic institutions, or legal systems that had been compromised through centuries of criminal coordination and political manipulation. Everyone needs to see this so they know the truth about how some families got rich by stealing money that was supposed to help Native Americans and build schools and roads, and how they're still doing it today through banks and corporations that have the same names, Lilly announced into recording equipment that was transmitting to global audiences, whose real-time responses were already generating millions of views and international attention that would prevent covert resolution of the situation through organizational coordination and authority manipulation that depended on public ignorance and media control about their criminal activities and institutional coordination. The institution's centuries-old control over historical narratives and legal frameworks had been shattered through 13-year-old determination to share discoveries that could benefit everyone rather than serving organizational interests that subordinated historical truth to contemporary power structures and criminal immunity. As helicopter sounds intensified and multiple extraction teams converged on the Whitfield ranch simultaneously, Sarah realized that Lilly's decision had transformed them from victims of institutional conflicts into agents of historical change, whose accidental discovery would reshape legal understanding, federal prosecutions, and territorial sovereignty in ways that honored both Indigenous rights and their families' autonomy to control their own destiny through choices that served public knowledge rather than organizational authority and criminal protection. Sullivan's treasure cave, now accessible through global broadcast documentation, would soon provide evidence for federal prosecutions that could recover hundreds of millions of dollars in stolen tribal trust funds while exposing institutional corruption that had shaped Western development for over a century. The criminal evidence would support legal proceedings that could restore territorial sovereignty and cultural heritage rights throughout the region, while providing their family with financial security through legitimate legal settlements, federal witness protection, and media opportunities that exceeded anything their agricultural crisis had made them imagine possible. Their desperate barn renovation had become a transformational discovery that would provide long-term financial stability through book deals, documentary opportunities, and consulting arrangements with legal organizations and academic institutions seeking to understand the full implications of evidence that challenged fundamental assumptions about Western expansion, territorial development, and institutional legitimacy. But more importantly, their accidental discovery had exposed criminal activities that would benefit society while protecting their family through visibility and legal proceedings that made them essential witnesses rather than expendable threats. Lilly would grow up as the teenager who changed American history by sharing discoveries that restored dignity to Indigenous nations while exposing systematic institutional theft that had affected territorial development and governmental accountability for over a century. Her future held opportunities for education, legal advocacy, and contributions to historical scholarship that would help ensure that such institutional deception could never again suppress evidence of criminal activities and territorial theft that transcended organizational authority and contemporary power structures. As federal agents, tribal legal representatives, and institutional security teams reached the Whitfield ranch simultaneously, they found a family whose courage had already transformed them from desperate ranchers into the guardians of historical truth, whose discoveries would reshape American understanding of Western expansion and institutional accountability
for generations to come, while providing the financial security and legal protection that their original crisis had made impossible through conventional agricultural or employment solutions. The $3 million in Sullivan's recovered gold would pale in comparison to the federal settlement funds and legal damages that their evidence would generate through criminal prosecutions and civil rights litigation, ensuring that their family's agricultural heritage would continue, while contributing to justice and historical accuracy that benefited indigenous nations and American society as a whole.